What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Book Binge for part 2 of my tier list where I rank every book that I read in 2022. Now, in the first part, I covered the first 10 books that I read over the course of the year. I was originally thinking that this series would be 3 videos where I covered about 15 books or so in each. I think it's going to be closer to 4, possibly even 5, where I cover more like 10 or so in each one, but that's fine. I'm just going to reiterate some of the rules in case you haven't watched that first one. And if you're watching this and you haven't watched part one, obviously go watch part one first because, I'm going to be building off of some of the things that I said in that video, all as obviously, I guess, is what I was trying to say. First off, I'm going to reiterate all of this is basically off the top of my head. So some of the ranking is not going to be the same as maybe previous me or future me would necessarily fully agree with. It's not fully thought out the way that I would normally do a ranking list, for example, and that means that some of the picks and where some things fall in accordance with others is going to be a little bit strange. And even looking at some of the picks that I did in terms of placements for last week's video of, part one of the tier list, I am kind of wondering why I made a couple of those decisions myself. But that's fine. That's just kind of the fun of doing something off the top of the head instead of making it all planned out the way that I tend to do. So without further ado, let me switch over here and we are ready to go into part two. I'm going to not preface this a whole lot the way that I did with the original video, just to cut down on, time a little bit. Let's go ahead and start where I left off last time with The Battle of the Labyrinth, Book 4 in Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Now, Battle of the Labyrinth is a book that I have strange memories of because back when I first tried to read the series back in 5th grade, I believe it was, I could not get through this book for some reason. It was so hard for me to actually finish Battle of the Labyrinth, and I have no clue why, to be perfectly honest. I guess there was just something about the book that made it hard for me to get through. Like, I tried 1 or 2 times and never finished it, but then eventually, several months later, I came back and finished Battle of the Labyrinth and then read The Last Olympian. I had a similar issue when I reread the series for the first time, actually, a few years after that, I believe in 8th grade. When I reread the series earlier this year, I didn't have that problem at all. In fact, I wonder what previous me was even thinking, because Battle of the Labyrinth is actually fantastic. The way it builds on the overall series arc that the Titan's Curse started to truly set forth was, in my opinion, quite fantastic. I was very happy with the way that worked out, and a lot of the revelations, things that happened, character interactions in this book were really quite wonderful in ways that I had not recalled them being. This book is definitely a lot better upon my reread than in my memory, unlike, some other books that I've been doing rereads of recently. In fact, I think, like, The Sea of Monsters is worse upon my reread than it was when I originally read the series the first 1 or 2 times, and I would say that The Lightning Thief is somewhere right around the same area. I appreciate it a lot more, but I don't know if I would consider it better or worse than I used to. Battle of the Labyrinth, I definitely consider a lot better than I used to, and I actually don't remember what order I ranked these books for sure back when I did my full series ranking and review earlier in 2022, I believe in May. I think that video came out. I don't remember for certain, but I'm going to go ahead and put this above the Lightning Thief, but below the Titan's Curse, just because I remember the Titan's Curse so fondly for how well it starts to set up some of the overarching plot. But the Battle of the Labyrinth really is quite good. It is pretty much on the same level as the Titan's Curse, so ranking it below or above doesn't really make a difference. But actually, looking at this here, I'm going to go ahead and make a small edit real quick. I'm going to go ahead and put the Lightning Thief below the Andromeda Strain. I don't really know why, but that looks better to me than how I had originally ranked that last week, so my apologies for that little divergence. Let's go into The Last Olympian, and this is going to be the last book in the Percy Jackson and the Olympians series, so I'm not talking about this much more in this tier list ranking series. And that works brilliantly, especially since people don't like me talking about this series. Anyways, The Last Olympian is such a good conclusion to the book, or to the series. I think I read this entire book in one 24-hour time period, so I read about 9 hours in that 24-hour time period just to read this entire book, and that's not something that I do very often. And when I do, I definitely don't make it, quite this much of a binge. But I binged this book because it was just so, so good. I really, really enjoyed this climax and think it is just as good, if not better, than it ever was. And is, it showcases one of the things that I think Riordan is the best at. He is very good at wrapping things up and tying things together, including with elements that you either forgot existed from previous entries or you thought were so small that maybe they didn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things, but it turns out they did. He's very good at wrapping things up in this way and tying off loose ends that need to be tied off. The only loose ends that he did not tie off in The Last Olympian were ends that were actually introduced in this book, hinting at the sequel series to come. If by the end of the Titan's Curse, Riordan knew what he was doing with the rest of the series, by the time he wrote the Battle of the Labyrinth and especially The Last Olympian, he probably had his full outline for the Heroes of Olympus lined out already, because things that happened in the very beginning of the first book of the Heroes of Olympus, just based off of what I remember of that series, The Last Olympian foreshadows some of that in several points, and I thought it was really good. Plus, uh, the vast majority of this book is just the climactic sequence of the battle of the series. Like, this book is the climax of the series without itself necessarily having a climax, because pretty much the entire book is the climax, and it just makes it really super exciting to read for, middle schoolers, YA readers who need something to get into reading, as long as they have a fascination with mythology. Like, I feel like is pretty common for kids to have, especially in my generation. Percy Jackson and the Olympians is a perfect introduction to get them, to enjoy reading. I think The Last Olympian is the perfect way to wrap up a series to make kids want to read more, especially. And for all of that, and just for my sheer enjoyment, I'm actually going to put The Last Olympian at the bottom of the cream of the crop, because in terms of Riordan's writing, it truly is cream of the crop worthy material. It's YA, it's rather simple, it's not complex, it's not anything too thought provoking per se, but just for sheer enjoyment. And, it's not even just nostalgia. I went into these books when I reread them this year with the air that I was like, I'm going to think about these critically and see if they actually hold up. And I really do think they hold up. The quality of this book astounded me upon my reread this year. But let's move on to more Stephen King and more of The Dark Tower with The Wastelands, Book 3 in the Dark Tower series. Now, if my opinion on Drawing of the Three is controversial, that's kind of because it is. But in a similar sense, my opinion of The Wastelands is similarly controversial. But it's not just because I have, grudges against some of the elements of the books or whatever, or some of it didn't feel as good as the rest. I really enjoyed The Wastelands, especially part one, which is the first half of the book. First half of The Wastelands is incredible. One of the best, ongoing, like, one of the best parts of the series. Is so good. The second half is very good as well. My main gripe with The Wastelands is that it doesn't finish the climax. I am very much of the opinion, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit, I'm very much of the opinion, sorry, that the part one of Wizard and Glass should have been at the end of The Wastelands. Just straight up. There was no reason to cut the book where it was cut off. The climax just stops right in the middle of it, and that kind of pissed me off reading it. So I don't dislike the book. What is in The Wastelands is very good, but the fact that it doesn't have a climax really ticks me off and actually makes me want to dock it a little bit for that reason. So because of that, it doesn't go into the cream of the crop, but I'm going to put it in between the Titan's Curse and the Battle of the Labyrinth, I guess. Like I said, what is in the novel is incredible, but because it only has half of a climax, I cannot, in good faith, rank it any higher than it is. Like, I cannot say that it is a perfect book because it doesn't have a full climax, and that really bugs me. However, we're going to move on to the next book that I read, which I believe was the first full book that I read in April. This is The Master and Margarita by, forgive me if I'm butchering this name, Mikhail Bulgakov, something like that. I'm trying to learn Russian, but that doesn't mean that I can speak anything pronounced Russianly without a terrible accent that sounds terrible. This book is a really, 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 really strange and weird one. Okay. I hadn't heard of what is it called? Magical realism. That's the term that I'm looking for. I hadn't heard of magical realism before I read this book, and magical realism is something that is more common and more frequently appears in Latin American literature, especially. But this Russian example of magical realism is kind of an acid trip of a read. Now, at the very beginning of it is like super interesting, but then there are parts of the book that take place in that get kind of meta in a weird kind of in-world way. It's really hard to describe because magical realism in general is really hard to explain. Um, this book, I did not dislike it as much as I was expecting to because I expected to absolutely hate it, even loathe it when I read it. So I did not dislike it. In fact, I quite enjoyed it for what it was. But man, it is weird and it is kind of confusing. In fact, if I hadn't had a friend of mine, Tokyo, shout out to Tokyo, thank you for explaining this to me at the time of reading, what a certain element of the book was, that kind of weird, in-worldly meta type of, like, however you want to describe that specific element of the book. If she hadn't explained to me what that was, a few chapters before it happened, I would probably have DNF'd this book. I was getting close to halfway and I was like, I don't dislike this, but man, it is not working. Like, it was right in that spot of like, I don't hate what I'm reading, but I'm not enjoying it at all and it feels like a waste of my time. Then Tokyo explained that element to me and I was like, wait, that actually makes sense. So then I wanted to see where it wrapped up. And I will say the climax of this book, or at least the wrap up, the conclusion to it, is fairly satisfying, especially for what the book is. It's a very strange one and kind of requires you to get all the way to the end to appreciate it in any full capacity. But it is hard to recommend. In fact, I would not be inclined to recommend Master and Margarita, sorry, to pretty much anybody because of that stuff and because, like I said, magical realism is hard to recommend. I'm gonna go ahead and put it below Dune, because I definitely liked Dune more than this. And although I didn't dislike this book, it is very out there for sure. Like very, very out there. Um, the next book that I'm going to talk about, how many have I talked about today? I did one, two, three, four. I believe that was the fourth one that I did today, right? Yeah, okay. I'm gonna go ahead and move on to Wizard and Glass, and as I was saying with the Wastelands, Part 1 of Wizard and Glass should not have been in Wizard and Glass. Now, it was a good section of the book. In fact, it does not decrease the quality of book 4 at all, having Part 1 in here, but Part 1 being in the Wastelands would have made the Wastelands a better book, and to a certain degree could have made Wizard and Glass a better book, or at least would have made it less polarizing to fans, at least, because this book, I would say like 85% of Wizard and Glass is a flashback. And if part 1 of the Wastelands had ended, or sorry, if part 1 of Wizard and Glass was at the end of the Wastelands, it would have ended pretty much at the part where Roland is essentially saying, okay, here's my story since you guys have been asking for it. And then fans would have known that Wizard and Glass was most likely going to be at least part or mostly a flashback, and it wouldn't have been as polarizing in that way. But for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter. The thing is, I think that Wizard and Glass and the Wastelands both would have been better if part 1 of Wizard and Glass was at the end of the Wastelands instead. I absolutely adored parts 2 and 3 of Wizard and Glass, though, like, one of my favorite things I read all year for sure, and probably the only thing, like, if barring a full reread of The Dark Tower, I do not think that I will go back to any section of The Dark Tower with, like, any desire to reread except for this. Like, I could see myself reading parts 2 and 3 of Wizard and Glass just because I can at some point again in the future, because those were so good, and because a lot of memories associated with certain, themes and stuff that happen in parts 2 and 3 of this book were just so impactful to me personally that I connected with them a lot. I'm gonna put Wizard and Glass up here. It is a very, very, very good book. I have a hard time calling it perfect because some of those objective, you know, split in the story moments there were, especially since my copy of the way Wizard and Glance had literally is the entire last chapter of the Wastelands is the prologue of Wizard and Glass. If that's what you were going to do, just put part one of Wizard and Glass in the Wastelands. But, you know, enough of me being salty about that particular element. The parts of Wizard and Glass that I loved so much that I cannot put this book anywhere besides pretty much at the top of this entire list here. Next up, let's talk about the Andromeda Evolution. Now, I'm going to try not to talk about this a whole lot since I've already been rambling a lot in this video, and also because I did a whole like 16-minute review. Was it 6? No, it was more like 20. I'm pretty sure it was a 26-minute review of this book. So like, I don't need to talk about it a whole lot. I did not love the Andromeda Evolution, and obviously a lot of people don't consider it a true Michael Crichton book because it was not written by Crichton at all. It was a sequel to the Andromeda Strain by Crichton, written by a different author, and there are elements of it that feel true to what Crichton was doing and feel like a natural evolution. I mean, pun, I guess, intended, but like it feels like a natural evolution to the Andromeda Strain in a lot of ways, and there were a few scenes of this book that I loved. Like one of my favorite scenes of the year is actually in this book. But there's a lot of problems with it too, most particularly in the final act. There's a lot of stuff in the final act that requires you to suspend your disbelief, and I know like that's a common thing to do, and when reading pretty much all fiction you have to suspend your disbelief, but there's a difference between suspending your disbelief and doing what Wilson did with the final act of this book. There's a lot of it that felt really undeserved and really stupid and really blown out of proportion in ways that did not work. There were parts of it that could have worked if they were done differently, but overall did not work. I'm going to put this above Brave New World because Brave New World didn't actually have any elements of its story or of its writing that I straight up enjoyed reading, whereas the Andromeda Evolution had, like I said, one of my favorite scenes of the year, but it has enough problems that it can't go above this rough around the edges category because, yeah, it has some problems for sure. Moving on to The Wind Through the Keyhole by Stephen King, being book 4.5 of The Dark Tower, an entry to the series that he wrote several years after he completed it, and that takes place in between 4 and 5. Now, this is a little bit of a weird one just because the way that it fits in with the whole series feels just a tiny bit off, I will admit, mostly because you know, just the way that it fits in between books 4 and 5 both makes sense, but also doesn't make sense, and the characters feel a tiny bit off at first. But overall, I think this entry really works. There's like, there's the fantasy element. Like, this is probably the closest to traditional fantasy that King gets in the entirety of the series, and I really appreciated that. But there's also some other really cool things that happen in this book as well. This one not only is also a lot of a flashback, the way that Wizard and Glass was a lot of a flashback, this one also has a story told within that flashback. And I really loved the story told within the flashback. That story has a lot of implications for characters within the series, like lore, I guess, of Midworld, essentially. I thought the flashback was incredible, the way that I thought the flashback in Wizard and Glass was incredible. But this flashback, it just had so much going for it. Like I said, it has like some of those traditional fantasy elements that King puts his own spin on that I really enjoyed. It also has several things about it that are like horrific. Like, this is also the most horror that Stephen King goes at any point in the rest of the series, save for maybe one moment in the very final entry. And I really loved those moments, the horror elements. Overall, I appreciate The Wind Through the Keyhole for what it does. You could easily read the series without putting this one in, and it would be perfectly fine. It's not a necessary entry at all, of course, but I honestly personally recommend reading it, and I personally recommend reading it in between books 4 and 5, even though it is a lot of a flashback after Wizard and Glass was a lot of a flashback, and it can feel like a lot, but the way that this added to the history of the world and the lore, like I said, just really worked for me, and it was still a worthwhile book to read for sure, even if it didn't continue the main plot of the series, so to speak. I'm going to go ahead and put this. Oh, where am I going to put this? I'm going to put this at the very bottom of Pretty Dang Good, just below the Drawing of the Three. I think I probably remember The Wind Through the Keyhole more fondly than the Drawing of the Three, but I think the Drawing of the Three is a better book. So that sounds like a pretty good spot to put it for me. So let's talk about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which was my classic that I read in May of this year. I really enjoyed Pride and Prejudice. However, that comes with a caveat. I did not enjoy it at the start. I did not like part one. It felt way too slow and way too meaningless, as if nothing was happening. It was kind of messy in a lot of ways. But then, like halfway through part two, it clicked for me. And when it clicked, it really clicked. Like from that point, like most of the way through part two, all the way through the end, I absolutely loved this book and had to give it a 5 stars at the very end of the journey, even though for a good portion of the book, like almost half of the book, I was like, this is maybe 2 stars at best. Like, I do not like this at all. Now that I know I enjoy it, I could easily give this a reread and appreciate everything about it so much more. It is not the typical type of book that I would have seen myself reading and enjoying, and thinking about the idea of reading more Jane Austen in the future is one of those like, I actually don't know. That's kind of strange. That's a weird concept to me, but I can definitely see myself doing it now because this one was actually incredible for what it was. Absolutely. And especially at the end, like I said, I just appreciate it so much more. Where am I going to put this? Oh my goodness. This Pretty Dang Good section is way big. Where do I put Pride and Prejudice on this list? Oh, I better think about it quick. There. I don't know if I like where that is, but I think that looks good. I don't even know, dude. Like, I cannot tell if that's where I want it or if I want it higher. Um, I'm just gonna call that good for now, and then I'm gonna actually go into this will be the last book that I talk about in this part of the ranking. It will be Wolves of the Calla by Stephen King, which is book 5 in the Dark Tower. I've talked a lot about Dark Tower in this video. Wolves of the Calla is fantastic. I think part 2 is a little bit slow in portions, and I feel like I'm somewhat in the minority of, I guess this is technically spoilers, but not really because I'm not actually going to say the character's name. There's a certain character that gets a lot of uh, page time in part 2 where he tells his tale. And the first 2 of those 3 sections where he does that were very good, but the third section started to run long a little bit, and I thought it was a little bit too much. The middle section where Roland and his gang, you know, just are kind of wandering around the town doing things with other people can run a little bit long, but I thought part 1 was amazing. Just the atmosphere of the town and everything was just amazing. Some of the best stuff that King has done with small towns and with characters within said town. Part 3 is the climax was really good and did some great stuff for the series that were like, okay, well that's something new. Where is this series going now? And um technically spoilers, I guess, but not really. King at the very end of this book, or maybe it's not even at the end, it's throughout this book, he starts to introduce slightly meta elements that I feel like that some fans of the series really, really dislike. I did not mind them, so they did not hinder my experience with this book, but that is something about this book that some people don't like. I really enjoyed Wolves of the Call. In fact, I read this one so fast compared to several of the previous entries. The question is if I put it in Pretty Dang Good here at the top or at the bottom of Cream of the Crop. Um, I'm going to put it at Cream of the Crop because even though part 2 is a little bit slow during certain portions of it, I think parts 1 and 3 of Wolves of the Calla are good enough to justify it being up there for sure. So I guess that is the end of part 2 oh my goodness, switch. There we go. I guess this is the end of part 2 of my tier list ranking of everything that I read in 2022. I hope you enjoyed this part, and if you are very upset or mad at me with some of my placements of some of these books, particularly some of the Dark Tower ones, because I feel like that's where some people are going to start to rage at me, especially after I did drawing of the 3 dirty in last week's video. I hope you enjoyed this and consider coming around next time for another ranking. I believe this will be next Thursday as well. Yep, next Thursday will be part 3 of this ranking, where I go over a few more entries. I'm not entirely certain which of or how many more I'm going to go through next week. I think I'm going to get through quite a few, but that shall come next Thursday. Thank you guys for watching. If you like my picks for today's video, if you don't, let me know in the comments below. Just, for fits and giggles. I want to see how enraged I made some of you guys with some of today's ranking, I guess. So thank you guys for watching. I'll be back on Tuesday for what I think is another review, question mark. Yes, I'll be doing another review on Tuesday, but the next Thursday, I'll be having part 3 of this ranking come out. So thank you guys for watching. As always, I'll be back again in the next episode of the Book Binge.